Nick, thank you so much for joining Juice Ready once again. How are you doing?
Hi, Dan. It's nice to have a proper setup this time.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I wanted to get the first podcast done just to see how the vibe would work, but I didn't think about the back stuff. The people need to be able to see you and have light and
Yeah,
those
yeah.
things.
No, but
If
I
it's
mean,
from
so when we started last week, it was cool because you looked like Edward Snowden in his bunker, which is perfect, and that's how I imagine you when I think of you.
I was sitting on my bed with a laptop because I didn't have a webcam on my computer. We had a webcam, we couldn't find it, but it's been found, as you can see.
Well, now you look like the Joey Diaz of Bloberg, so that's perfect.
Yeah,
Like a
so
professional
culture.
professional podcaster. So, just for the listeners to give you guys some background, um, the Juice Ready podcast is really for me to just learn, and hopefully, people will learn with me at the same time. Nick likes to talk about politics. I like to listen to Nick talking about politics. And last week we covered South Africa. What we thought we'd do a little bit this week is have a discussion about why just actually global politics. Where does it come from? Why do people fight with each other? And when did it start? And has this been going on since the beginning of time? What do you think, Nick?
Not the beginning of time, but the beginning of civilization, yeah. And before that too, undoubtedly humans, when we were hunter-gatherers, were killing each other.
So we have a mutual friend, and I won't say any names, but some people are not happy with borders and laws. So give us a bit of context. What happens when there's no borders and laws? Don't mention Somalia. Let's use another country.
Well, Somalia is a perfect example.
Okay.
Example would be Afghanistan. Uh, since the Brits and the Russians arrived, it's been chaos there, and it will continue to be chaos. You always have that when great powers get involved in areas. Just that's the nature of it through time. It's just gotten logically advanced in the last 60, 70 years. There's no difference.
Okay. So why don't we go? So talking about civilization, why don't we go back to sort of? I mean, there were, I think, civilization. It depends where you want to start, but because people
It
people
started
say people say civilization the way we know it started in China, and then a little bit more in Europe, and then to the Americas.
There were wait, let me get this right. There were four places where it started independently.
The Indus Valley, the Yellow River Valley. What were the two other ones?
There was another one centered from Egypt all the way through to Turkey and then back down into what we would call Iraq today. Think of it as like a boomerang crescent, like a crescent of a moon. It was
Okay,
literally a crescent like that. So,
and that's
so from
that's
think of Cairo to Baghdad, but in a semicircle.
so that just sort of between the Tigris and the Euphrates in what is now modern day
And
Iraq.
and the Nile and the Mediterranean coast.
Okay, cool.
And that's where it happened first. And the fourth place was independently in both North America and South America.
Oh wow. Okay, so the Inca and the Aztec civilizations.
Long before them, long,
Oh wow.
long, yeah, thousands of years before them.
Okay.
But yeah, I didn't know that until recently. Also, I mean,
Do we have names for those? I mean, I didn't know that either.
were the Olmecs, who were from about 2000 BC or so. We don't. There's another American culture called the. Oh, now you're really taxing me. Okay, I don't know the name of the culture. The Clovis culture. They were. Sorry, it's not the Clovis culture. You must say that out. I think I don't know the name of the culture, but there was a Native American culture in North America that basically had their version of civilization without a lot of things.
Okay.
But yeah, fully functional cities. There was a city in Mississippi, which we think had about 60,000 people at one point. And that was in the BC times.
Okay, and how it used to work before countries were involved, they were just big cities, and the sort of gold mines and copper mines that you found between the cities would be allocated to randomly, or how does this work? How does it work when you find something very? Was it just open? Was it just open season?
Well, no. What happened is as cities started to grow, so you needed to have more and more political organization within the city. So they've done sociological studies whereby once a group reaches 150 people or so, you start to, as an individual, lose track of all the people around you. Right. 150 seems to be about the human number, and how we know that is hunter-gatherers that still exist today and existed in the past. Their numbers very rarely go above 150, 160, 170 maybe. It does happen, but it's rare. And in cases where it does happen, there's often more political structure.
Do they split it? Do they generally tend to split into two, like 60 and 60?
No, you start. Well, first of all, groups split off over time, and that is how we spread across the planet originally. It was one group that it was 1, 2 groups, 3 groups, 4 groups, and people would split off as you reached your carrying capacity of 150. We didn't have enough technological innovation. Everyone was hunting and gathering at the time, so people split off once you reach that size. A disagreement in the family, the son doesn't agree with something his father wants, so he takes his new wife and a bunch of people that maybe support him, and they go off and never to be seen. That's what happened.
Wow, that's interesting. And then, so
over time, Go ahead.
I was going to say, and also at sort of when we're going back millions of years here, but
not millions, thousands.
But hold on. Okay, so we go back about 50 million years is when we had our last common ancestor with chimpanzees, right?
Not 50, 7.
7 million.
7
okay, so I'm going back way too far. Right, thank you for that.
Primates didn't even exist 50 million years ago.
Okay, this is why I created the podcast, to learn these things. Okay, cool. So, but I think
it's about we think it's 7.
Okay,
it's not confirmed. I think it's 7 million years.
Yes, but also a couple thousand years ago, this was correct me if I'm wrong, this was during the last ice age, so the water levels were not as high as they are now, and there was places where humans could walk and explore, and that's why there's a lot of islands in the Pacific that have people on them, where some of them got there from rafting, but some of them got there just from the human population spreading out over the globe.
If anyone goes and looks at a map today of all those islands in Southeast Asia, from the actual what we today would call the Asian mainland, all the way through to Papua New Guinea, just before Papua New Guinea, there's an island called Sulawesi, and that dividing line is as far as people could move without boats until 10,000 years ago. You're talking about an area the size of Europe that's now submerged by water. Just to give you an idea of the amount of land that was lost. That equates to about 100 to 120 meters, depending on where you are in the world, of sea level rise since the last ice age ended. So just an interesting tidbit. A lot of the myths in the early religions, and we know it today as the flood myth in the Bible, it's thought that those myths were very real events whereby all the lands that the people had been living in for thousands of years were getting flooded. And so those myths it's a theory, but they might have a very real place in our history, because the Mediterranean flooded into the Black Sea and flooded a huge area of land where we know people were living in large quantities. The area between Denmark and
Sweden
and England, between Denmark and England, was entirely populated and was an area called Doggerland. It was populated it was probably one of the most productive and fertile areas of Europe up until it flooded about 5,000-6,000 years ago. And the UK was part of the European mainland until that flood happened. And I mean, you can go all over the place, wherever you want across the planet. There were massive floods. I mean, 120 meters of sea. Just think about that. We're worried about 5 or 6 meters at the moment.
Yeah, apparently the Mediterranean as well also flooded like a basin.
A long time ago.
used to be a desert. Oh, that was a bit longer ago.
A long time.
So I mean, I always thought that Noah's Ark was a bullshit story, but thank you, Nick. Maybe I
The
should.
story, I mean, the story itself, I don't want to offend any religious people.
Sure.
But, I mean, it's a myth. But at the same time, there very definitely was a collective human experience of flooding from about, let me just work it out in my head, from about 9,000 years ago to about 6,000 years ago. A great period of flooding periodically all the time.
And so
some of them very sudden.
And very sudden. So that story could have been passed down through the generations, and
that's probably what
turns into a Bible story that we read in Sunday school today.
Yeah,
it's cool.
It's very likely, but not confirmed.
Okay.
I mean, how do you confirm? You can't confirm that, but it makes sense in your. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, unless you find the ark, right?
Yeah, some ark, but remember, I mean, the ark is probably some 4-meter little rock of boat or something from some poor survivor that managed to surf away, and then it became like a legend, and legend becomes myth, and eventually gets incorporated into religions and those type of things.
Yeah, well, when I was about 8 years old, I already knew it was nonsense because you can't fit every animal on the ark. And I still listen to Ricky Gervais explaining that to Carl Pilkington to this day. So, guys, check out Ricky Gervais and Carl Pilkington explaining the ark. Well, check out Ricky explaining the ark to Carl. I'm going to fast forward 1,000 years, Nick, and we go from cities to nation states. You talk about there being. Sorry, Nick. I was trying to quickly say you talk about there being sort of 150 people, and that's where you stop recognizing everybody, and then you need to form political systems. So take us how it gets from cities to nation states.
So we know that the first domestication of any food occurred in southern Turkey. That's where you find wild wheat, essentially, the wild varieties of wheat that we then domesticated over thousands of years. So there's a very interesting culture in that area. We're talking at the end of the last age, 13,000 years ago. And you're thinking of the area stretching from Israel up through into Turkey and down into northern Syria, Iraq. Part of that strip, part of that crescent strip. And they were a culture called the Natufians. And the Natufians, what they managed to do is they weren't quite domesticated yet, but they were harvesting the wheat annually, the wild wheat annually.
So by domesticated, you mean they hadn't got domesticated crops?
The crops were occurring wildly, but they would come back to the same spot every year. So they would migrate, and we know this quite thoroughly. They would migrate during the winters down further south, and they would be foraging and hunting and kind of surviving, for lack of a better term. But they were quite proficient at it by that time. It was all subsistence, but they were very adept at it. And there was the beginning of animal domestication. They had dogs as well. And then eventually, over time, a process of 1,000, 2,000 years, they developed agriculture as we know it today. And it spread like a lightning rod very quickly. And so what happens is you suddenly see these towns of 1,000 people popping up all over the place. And really, that was the beginning of it, at least in our context. And when I say our context, I'm saying if you're anyone from Iran through to Russia.
Afro-Eurasia.
No, not or not all of Afro-Eurasia, because remember, it happened later on in China. It happened later on in India and Pakistan independently. Okay. No doubt under influence, because all of a sudden, all these people coming from the West. But it still was independent. There were different crops were used. Oddly enough, just a small little side thing, the first domesticated crop ever that we know of as of today was actually rye. And it happened by mistake, because in the wild, rye looks exactly like wheat. It's very difficult to tell the difference unless you really know what you're doing. And rye is technically a weed. So the joke is that we domesticated weeds first, and then came the wheat afterwards. But yeah, it was rye first, as far as we can tell, and barley, because they loved their alcohol quite early on, apparently. And bread through wheat, which is the grass after all.
And how do we know they had dogs?
Oh, we find them all over the place, and we also find dogs from way before that. Humans domesticated dogs. We don't know, somewhere 26,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago.
Okay. So they've always been around. The skeletons are small, like little poodles, or are they like wolves?
Oh no, well, they were. You would see nothing that we would see today. Like many of the dog breeds that we know of today were created in the last 200 years, and also through globalization. Chihuahuas, for instance, come from Mexico. They didn't exist anywhere else until globalization happened. Those dogs that have no hair? You know what they look like? I don't know what they're called. They're ugly as fuck.
I don't know. They're from China or what?
They're really ugly, and the ones I'm thinking of are from China. The reason they have no hair is because they're easier to cook.
Oh God, that is fucking disgusting. China, sort your shit out, and also stop eating bats.
That's the truth. They were bred because they're easier to cook without hair. And
no offense, Chinese listeners, I love you all. So take us from sort of the larger cities where you said that people are domesticated, but I quickly corrected you because the crops were domesticated. Because where we're from, in Vinelands, if someone's domesticated, it means that they're settling down with their girlfriend and what you might call them whipped. Take us to sort of how we get to the nation states. You got to have a bit of humor in the pod.
Over time, people, the cities just got bigger.
So they went to war.
No. The advantages of farming were just such that you outcompeted the hunter-gatherers over time. You had to work harder, and you generally actually lived a slightly less healthier lifestyle in regards to wear and tear on your teeth, wear and tear, bones, just general wear and tear. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle was far less damaging to the human body because we naturally were suited for it, as opposed to living in a city, which you could still argue is unnatural at the end of the day compared to our evolution. But it was a cultural thing. So what started to happen was, because of the sheer advantages of crops and the fact that food was reliable most of the time, the cities, A, got bigger through sheer population growth, and B, they also, there were two things going on. Also, a lot of people came in from the wild. They would come to trade. They had something to trade from out in the wild, and they saw all the advantages themselves, and they would come to the city, just like it's happening today. People, to give you a South African context, move from the Eastern Cape, they come to Cape Town or go to PE. It's the exact same thing happening for thousands of years. So much so that today, more than half the population of the planet lives in a city. But I mean, it's really that long-term shift from the rural to the urban that we're talking about that's been happening for the last 10,000 years. So eventually the cities get too big, whereby you need to have some form of codified structure that everyone agrees to function, for the city to function. Sure. And so what happens is, over time, you get the growth of all of the different monarchies. It was generally based on monarchies back in the day because that was the only way that people knew how to ensure political stability.
How did that start? Who's the first guy that said, "I'm the king"?
It goes back to tribal times. There was a tribe leader, and he was the head of the family, and it eventually evolved into monarchies.
Okay.
You'd get your chiefdoms, which are like larger tribes where there's one big head and then extended family underneath, and they would all live in one city, so to speak. But then over time, people would come in from the outside and population growth, but they would all have to submit to that chief's authority.
Yeah. And I suppose it started with the head of a family who also was the head of a few families, one of the strongest men in the tribe. and over time it turned into like a bit more like who was cleverer and more diplomatic and better at negotiating.
And sometimes it was just broad luck. The barbarians arrive from a huge barbarian army arrives at your gates that you've never seen before, and you can have the best administrative skills and be running your city perfectly. It's still going to get into the ground.
True.
That's just the nature of what it is.
So going back to like I always think of it as like, okay, because I know that the Germans and the Italians, they started off with cities and they turned them into nation states when sort of that was what was required in the world at the time. But how does it work if you have two cities and you have I know that, look, so gold and silver and copper are sort of very, the value of gold and copper and silver was invented by Europeans and Asians to be able to trade with. And they still have an intrinsic value today because of that. And we can have another episode about economics, because I think it's so integral to politics that we probably do have to have another episode.
I can talk political economics, that side, but I can't do raw economics.
Not necessarily markets, but just how it affects politics. Yeah.
That's quite far.
But what I'm saying is for the listeners to get a practical example, if you have two cities and in the middle of those cities there's a gold mine, who owns it, and how did they figure out who's going to be able to mine it and take the gold? Was it just done through a series of wars and fighting and killing each other?
It wasn't always. As much as there's warfare and there's a lot of it, there's far more cooperation, or else we wouldn't be where we are today. I know people like to highlight on the wars, but at the end of the day, there's far more cooperation fundamentally than there is warfare. It's just we focus on the wars because it makes things nice and neat. But yeah, just so that you know, it's far more cooperation.
Yeah, but also it's more. I suppose it's more.
Think of a diplomatic marriage. Let's say you're two equally sized cities trying to go for the same area. You likely, because you're two cities close to each other, you likely have lots of shared inheritance between the two of the cities. Just over time, over time there would be mixed marriages between the cities and people migrating between the two cities, and there would be some conflict backwards and forwards, but there'd also be diplomatic marriages. Those have been going on for as long as monarchies have existed. As long as those chiefs and tribes happen, there's been politics going in the background. So I marry this one, so I marry that one. And eventually those, between warfare and the diplomacy, the early diplomacy going on, one city became two cities became a region becomes a state becomes an empire. The two things that changed over time was, one, technology. There was a lot of technological development in the last 10,000 years, never mind exclude the last 300. Empires like the British Empire that we know of, the one up until the end of World War II, just couldn't occur in the past because the logistics behind the empires just didn't exist.
Yeah.
Whether it's technological or whether it's theoretical in your head, it's all built up by itself over time.
Right. And I suppose, look, there's more diplomacy than war, but it's not as sexy. It's not as sexy to learn about diplomacy and cooperation in school. You'd rather learn about war. History teachers would rather teach.
There's a lot of war, so it comes in boom and bust cycles. So you have a period of cooperation, and then some area has peace and prosperity for however many years, and then there were a lot of humans that were migrating at the time. And so whether they come through with new technology, or whether they come through with maybe a virus that no one in your area has ever had before, to give you a more modern day example, what happened in the Americas when the Europeans arrived. Yeah. That type of stuff, they didn't know it, but they were conducting a form of biological warfare at the time.
Sure.
That would wipe out an entire area, and in come the new settlers. And a new culture would form, but that culture would break apart. There'd be some wars, and eventually it would resettle itself. And over time, you get these groups of people.
Okay. And Sorry. Say that last part again.
Over time, you get these nations forming. So you get the first civilizations in Babylon, and Samaria, and you get Egypt, and then later on you get the Indus Valley, and then you get China later on. They all form independently, and then they flourish for a while, and then either through plague, war, or natural disaster, they collapse.
Okay, so Nick, this is what the listeners have been waiting for the entire episode. Who built the pyramids?
The Egyptians. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I
Okay,
can't.
the
I can't.
Egyptians.
I can't give the details about it, but I'll trust the scientists on this.
Okay. So I mean, so let's fast forward another 1,000 years. Now we've got nation states and
Or you got early empires. So if you think about the Roman Empire, which basically was the majority of the Mediterranean coast and Western Europe and some areas in West Asia, they got as big as they could. There was literally, they couldn't expand the empire anymore. There were too many enemies on too many sides and too much internal logistical problems in managing the empire. So it got as big as it could.
And geography doesn't make it easy when you got to go over mountains and deserts.
Remember, for thousands of years, the fastest form of communication was a boat or a horse.
Right, unless you're the Mongols, then you can expand. I mean, even their empire split into 4 at some point. But
they fell apart very quickly.
Okay, I thought they went for quite a while. I was just thinking.
Within 100 years, the entire empire had fallen apart into smaller states.
Okay, and tell us about. So, I mean, you mentioned the Roman Empire. So, is it not when the East and Western Roman Empire fell apart? Is that not? Well, first it was the West, which sort of fell apart and became the German states and the Frankish Empire, which was France and then Genoa and Venice, which became Italy. But is it not the West? Is it not the fall of Constantinople that sort of that's when colonization started and people started leaving Europe to colonize Asia, Africa, and the Americas?
So, just some context. We're talking of the period at the moment in the 1450s, 1460s. But before we can go into that, something very big had happened. 2 things very big had happened 100 years before that. One, the Mongols had formed under Genghis Khan and gone on their worldwide conquest and rampage. And it had done 2 things. The conquest itself brought gunpowder and cannon technology from the East and China into Western Asia, so the Middle East and Europe. And that was a major change in warfare. And the other thing that happened was the Silk Road got reestablished. And oddly enough, in the year of the virus, a plague, the bubonic plague, started. The Great Plague, the Black Death. The Black Plague started in China at the same time that the Mongols were busy.
Right.
Thing.
So they spread.
They spread the plague from east to west.
Right, but now tell us more about the Silk. You mentioned the Silk Road, but I think some of the listeners don't know what the Silk Road is, and I've got a basic idea. So, isn't it the trading route from sort of Eastern Europe to China, and it goes
other way around? But mostly it's normally goods from the east and money from the west. But the Romans had a lot of economic problems. They knew about the Chinese, but they constantly had money leaving the empire going west because everyone wanted silk. So much so that they even banned silk. But
they banned silk.
No one listened.
But they couldn't ban like black pepper and turmeric.
It was still very expensive. So it was very much until recent times the commodities of the rich. Salt, pepper, silk, all the stuff that naturally would come from East Asia. It was for the rich or the lucky, or you'd save up 2 years to buy that one Silk Road. Type stuff.
Well, I mean, in many ways, the rich were just lucky, because back then there wasn't like you couldn't just create a startup and come have a rags to riches story like.
You couldn't just go and make a silk
Jeff Bezos.
No, you couldn't just go and make a silk crop in Western Europe. It just
Right.
wasn't possible. It just wasn't possible at those times. You had to trade. But yeah, the Silk Road that the Mongols established, it allowed, or even going back in the day, like to the time of the Romans and the Han Chinese, they had been trading in silk and goods, and there'd always been some form of trade going back to the founding of civilization. But it increased in volume and demand, along with the Black Plague, and those two things caused a lot of chaos in Europe. Not just Europe, across the entire of Afro-Eurasia. So anywhere from 30 to 60% of your population was dying in a period of a few years. I mean, just take COVID and times it by a billion to give you a sense of the horror. I mean, entire societies were collapsing. Everyone thought that this was the end times and Jesus was about to return. I'm not joking.
Right, and yeah, and then it was in this. Sorry, that broke up a bit, but it was in the scripture as well. So they thought that this was a revelation.
Yeah. They thought the second coming was about to occur, and that they'd all been wicked and horrible, and that's why the Reformation occurred. So the main reason why colonization started was there was no more land in Europe, so people had to go and search elsewhere, and it was known that finding a new Silk Road, basically a water version of the Silk Road, was what was desired, because Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, fell in the 1460s to the Muslim Ottomans, and it was occupied, became the Istanbul that we all know today. But what happened was, obviously, because of religious tensions between Europe and the Muslim Middle East, Europe being Catholic at the time, the trade from the West was effectively cut off, other than illegal means, by the Ottomans.
Okay, so they kind of
it was an embargo.
Yeah, it was basically like an embargo, like Iran when they closed the Strait of Hormuz. So
yeah, it's the exact same thing, and so people had to go and look out. So one of the reasons why you get American Indians was because when the Europeans first contacted them, they thought they were in East Asia, but they were in the.
But if they thought they were in, so I do actually want to have another episode with you about American politics, and then I want to have another episode with you about African politics. But just while we're talking about Europe, is it not so? Why did they actually say Indians? Did they not think that they were in China or Japan? Because India is on the subcontinent.
They didn't remember. Most Europeans had never met a Chinese or an East Asian looking person in their life. Generally, the known world in that time was, if you were, let's say, in Paris, you knew maybe up until Iran about stuff, about that people there, and there were interactions there, because there were always interactions occurring historically from Iran and that side. Now, if you were in Iran, you would know a bit more, because they'd been trading with India and all of them for a while. And so every kingdom knew about the next people next to them, but there were degrees of separation eventually. So it was known that there was a great empire in the East, aka China, but no one knew anything other than that. Everyone knew that where the silk came from, but that's how it went.
Oh, so basically they were seeing Indian people and trading silk, but they didn't know they didn't know the source.
And there was they knew there was a source, and they obviously knew of China, but that's as far as the knowledge went.
Okay.
Every now and then, a very weird looking person by their standards would rock up in a boat or with a horse cart, but often there were middlemen, because when you add in middlemen, you add in profit. So the empires in between Europe and China would tax the goods, just like you would do today. You tax the goods, you add a markup, and off it goes to the next empire, and on and on and on.
And I suppose that's what drove the innovation to build boats with sails, because we don't want to pay all the tax to Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria.
One direct trade route.
Right. And I mean, those countries that I said now are modern day countries, but at the time it would be more like Babylon, Mesopotamia. Persian Empire.
Yeah, but they wanted to avoid the middlemen.
Yeah. Okay.
And at
yeah.
the same time, population pressures in Europe. There was no more land. Everyone was fighting everyone constantly. So find more land to go put people on. Not only do you get the goods of whatever's being made in the land, but you also alleviate the population pressures in your cities. Because remember, everyone had been ravaged by plague, and the population had slowly started to recover.
So from a group of like 150 people to nations, we still, and I think what we can do is we can touch on the basics of like when Europeans started landing in Asia, America, and Africa, and why they did it, and then we can have another whole episode about American politics if you want to do that.
Yeah, that's sure.
But why do you? I suppose like another question I would ask you is why do you think? And this might be a question for an anthropologist, but why do we still have tribalism, and why does it dominate our politics in 2020? Is it just the way we've evolved? It's a human evolution thing.
Nature. It's human. It's evolution. The same reason why you get racism. It's the fear of the other, the one that doesn't look like you.
Right.
And it's very easy to take advantage of that for political purposes, especially when there's religion involved, which up until recently there's always been involved.
Okay, and how do we? So you say up until recently. Are you just talking about up until states realized that they could be secular and get things done better?
Oh no, it still happens today. One of the reasons that America supports Israel so vehemently is not only for geopolitical reasons, but I mean, as you know, a large section of the United States population is fundamentally very, very religious and Christian, and they think that the Jews have to have control of Jerusalem for the second coming to happen. I kid you not.
That is ridiculous. I mean, and it still says, yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah, and I kind of knew that in the back of my mind, but now that you've said it, it makes me think how silly that is. And so so I'm Christian. I don't go to church. I don't read the Bible. It's doesn't make much sense to me. But I mean, I do believe in
Judeo-Christian background. Yeah.
I do believe in Judeo-Christian values. If I was born in Iran, I'd be Muslim, and I would believe in Muslim values, no problem. There's a couple of things that in Christianity and in Islam that I would outright reject. I mean, there's a couple silly things in the Bible, the Quran, and the Torah, but not to get too religious. But so, well, what was the first secular state, and why did they? I think was it France? No.
Boy, now you're asking me a question. I have absolutely no idea.
This is what the listeners have been waiting for. A political question Nick doesn't know. No, I think it was France. But okay. So basically,
but the idea has been percolating for a while because of the very many abuses that the papacy did over a long time. That the political power needed to be separated from religious power. That had been percolating in Europe for a while already. And so as Europe developed economically, partly through colonialism, you got the emergence of new elites that weren't just the nobles that were dependent on what land they had. You start to get business people that became rich through trade and through production and through technological innovation. And they all wanted a seat at the table. And that's how you got your democracies eventually. Was those groups of people became too big for the nobles and the monarchs and the kings and the emperors to ignore.
Okay. But I see, I mean, I think it still says "In God We Trust" on the dollar bill. So on the coin, I think it
says it on the notes too. I think. I mean, I can't think of the notes off the top of my head right now, but I'm pretty sure it says it on the notes as well. But it also says at the same time that the state must be secular. It's kind of like how you were saying, whereby you acknowledge your Judeo-Christian background, and everyone was religious at the time. I mean, just to give the American example, when they founded the country, they were all incredibly religious, of course, in those times. But at the same time, they were very aware in the back of their heads how religion had been abused. Many of those people in America were Protestants that had been persecuted within Europe, the ones that emigrated, the ones that weren't born in America but started to emigrate there over time. They were all Protestants that had been, and Protestants, Anglicans, Lutherans, all of the non-Catholic Christian religions that had been persecuted across Europe. So they all knew how dangerous it was when religion was mixed with the state. And that's why you get to America, whereby they're very religious, but a lot of them don't want the religion in the state.
Yeah, and I think so. So religion is a big part of why colonialism actually happened, and why massive, people will sort of say Europeans migrating from Europe to Africa and the Americas is because of religious persecution. And actually, just bringing up, if you look at the 1 Rand coin, it says "Soli Deo Gloria" on it, which means in Latin, glory to God alone. So we still have it in South Africa. I don't know why that's on that coin, because that 1 Rand coin comes from post 94. That 1 Rand coin was released in just pre 94. I think that 1 Rand coin, the small 1 Rand coin, because it used to be a bigger one. The small 1 Rand coin, well, with the springbok on it. Now it's a smaller one with the springbok. It says "Soli Deo Gloria" on it. Go look at a 1 Rand coin. It's literally, there's religious stuff on our money in South Africa, and it was made in like 1992. So
I don't have my wallet on me at the moment, but I'll look afterwards once we're done here.
Yeah.
But there's no problem. I mean, I personally have no issue with that. There's no problem with identifying with your religious past, whatever that is. I mean, I used to be Catholic. I'm most definitely not Catholic anymore, but I admit the influence that it had on me.
So I mean, I'm yeah. So hold on. I won't tell any. I do have a problem with it. I prefer to have no religion in politics or on coins, and purely because so many people have died in the name of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, you name a religion. So many people have died because of it. And I just want to live in a world without it. Can't we just all be...
You're in the minority still. I mean, the idea is, when 70% of your population is Christian, the government can't not address it.
Right.
The state can't not address it as a state. Like, there has to be some form of capacity that it's acknowledged and I guess the word embraced maybe is the wrong word, but to give you the idea I'm trying to get across.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I see what. So they want to embrace it, but
they'll say, what they're trying to say basically is it has its place in society.
Okay. So, but on the Rand,
we're still gonna try and not let it influence politics. Okay. That's the idea. That's the hope. I mean,
I see. Okay, then I'm fine with it. I just think, on the Rand, that's got nothing to do with Christian. It says "In God alone we trust." So it could be he's talking about God. Yeah, that's great. But please, so is that the reason? So that we're going to try and not let it interfere with politics because we're a secular state?
Yeah, essentially, you need to let people know that as a state, like as a collection of people living in a geographical area, you need to let people know that you get them, you understand them. Like, many people say that the ANC just like buys votes. They're not just buying votes; they're ensuring the stability of the country at the same time. It's a social contract that we all, whether we like it or not, we all agreed to after 1994, was there would be high taxes and high redistribution of wealth, because if we didn't, there would have been a civil war. And you see, even today, the lack of our economic, I mean, a lot of it's changed, but a lot of it hasn't changed. I mean, we could go, that's a whole different podcast. But the reason why the people like EFF exist is because of that lack of real economic change.
Right. Yeah. So there is a lack of transformation.
too slow.
The speeding up of economic equality.
A combination of the speeding up of economic inequality, which has gotten worse since 1994, but even more than that is the largely racial parameters it takes on still today. The whole podcast in and of itself, but they do still exist today, and that's why you get such extremists in our politics today.
Okay. So when would you say, so colonization and max exodus from Europe was sort of, what year are we talking now? We're talking between 1400s, when the Portuguese built
mid 1400s. Well, I guess you could say all the way through to the 1800s. It was different areas in the world at different times.
Okay. And so it was first the Portuguese that built a shipping empire to help them with trade, and then I think it was the Dutch that made a company out of it.
The Portuguese were first, followed very quickly by Spain and England, and then followed afterwards by France and the Dutch. But once the knowledge, which spread quite quickly, that there was a lot of land out there to be found, once the knowledge was out there, within 100 years, everyone was exploring and colonizing. To give you an example, if we go from Constantinople through to the founding of the first colony in what would become America, it's 150 years.
Wow.
It's not much amount of time, relatively speaking.
I mean, in the grander scheme of things, that's nothing. And at the politics in Europe at the time, what are we looking at? Are we saying, was it also a similar political spectrum that existed, or was it secular?
No, it was no secular. Everyone was Catholic, or you were a heretic. You get burnt at the stake.
Oh God! So there was quite a lot of witches, at the time.
Slightly before it, but witch trials were going on about all over the place. There was persecution of Jews, persecution of Muslims, and I'll say in the Muslim lands, persecution of all the non-Muslims too.
Sure.
That's just what it was. At the same time, the Reformation was starting at the same time in Europe. So
tell us more about
other than Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism, all the other Christian faiths that you know were started in those times. Lutheranism, Anglicanism, Protestants, Reformed, the Dutch Reformed Church. Just to give a South African context to this, the very people that came to South Africa were both Dutch and French Protestants.
Okay.
And the NG Kerk that we know today is the Dutch Reformed Church.
Okay.
The Reformed version of Catholicism.
There's also like Anglican, Presbyterian, Methodist.
All of them come from.
What is that? Sorry, I know we were meant to talk about politics, but what is that about? Why did they just find things in the Bible that they weren't happy about?
There was long-standing unhappiness with the Pope, and
I agree. I can understand that.
Large amounts of evident corruption that were happening at the time. And also remember, a lot of people had died recently because of the Black Plague. And so everyone thought that God was punishing them for being bad Christians.
Okay. So,
how could I forget it? The printing press. The printing press enabled the Bible to be okay, wait, I have to explain this quickly before we finish.
The good news, yeah.
Back in the day, the church was also where all knowledge and education was. If you wanted to know anything, you would have to become a priest, because everything was written in Latin, because that's what the Romans wrote in. Right. And a lot of knowledge was lost after Rome. So everything was centered around the church, obviously being in Rome. They had the leftovers of all the libraries and stuff, and everything was in Latin. So all the churches was in Latin. Think about it. If you're a peasant in northern Germany, how are you ever going to learn Latin? It's just not going to happen. No. So what happened was, one of the major developments was the Bible got translated into all of the languages that you know in Europe. And through the printing press, it got disseminated throughout Europe. And so suddenly everyone was interacting with the Bible themselves. It wasn't in the confines of a church and a priest who had to be loyal to Rome, essentially. And so you start to see that split between the religion and the state. Suddenly, a local prince had access to a Bible,
Right.
as opposed to when he would need a clerical advisor from the Pope.
Okay, and I'm an advertising guy and I'm a marketing guy, so I can kind of put two and two together here. If we find that the copy that you're writing, which is maybe the Anglican or the Presbyterian, and is selling more, it's selling more books than the copy that I'm writing, which is maybe the Methodist,
No.
we're gonna print more of those because they sell better in different areas.
Well, remember, at the start it was all just the Catholic Bible.
Right.
And then over time, as people started to engage with the material themselves individually, and in the background, you had all of these issues occurring within Catholicism. So you start to see these breakaway movements occur. You get Martin Luther and the rest of them.
Okay, and when did it change from, because don't Catholics, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know anything about religion, don't Catholics pray to Mary and ask Mary to tell God something for them? Am I ignorant?
She's venerated in Catholicism. She's like, I think, the only human in the Bible that's made to ascend.
Right.
Jesus obviously wasn't human according to the Bible. He was God reincarnated himself.
Okay,
but Mary was.
Okay, sorry, I was going to say I'm just going to blame that on my brother for telling me that that Catholics pray to Mary.
One of the points that were raised by all of the non-Catholic Christians was that they venerated Mary too much, and it kind of morphed into that.
Yeah, so that became a bit of a sticking point. So I think I'm going to ask you one last question, Nick, and this one's going to blow you away. Every time I think of people in that time, I always laugh and I think, fuck, we've come a long way. How stupid we used to be. And then I have to laugh at myself because we actually haven't come that far. How far we got to go till we get rid of, till we have truly secular states?
It will take time. I mean, but you see the trends are, whether you're looking in the Middle East or whether you're looking in Europe or America or you're looking here, there's a general trend towards less religiousness over time, especially in the last two decades especially, but the last 50 years. And that's really just knowledge.
Okay.
I mean, just to give you my example, I was the wonderful Catholic altar boy until 13, 14. And I mean, maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was being introduced to the sciences, but I started to run into all these barriers where what I was being taught just didn't square with the Bible.
Right.
And eventually the evidence becomes so overwhelming, you have your mini existential crisis that I had. None of this is real. Oh my God. Sorry to offend anyone, but that's exactly what happened. I had a period of a year whereby I had a complete mini freak out that none of this was real. And yeah, I mean, you take that, you amplify it by hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people. You go and you add, those people then have kids. Those kids aren't brought up in a religion. They may get baptized just to please the grandparents, but that's as far as it goes.
Did you have
my kids are not getting baptized. Not a chance.
No. Did you have a good relationship with your priest?
He was actually a wonderful Irish man who drank way too much on the weekends, and so he had bad breath. But other than that, he was a very nice man.
Okay, cool. So Nick, I'd love to have you back on, and we'll talk about African politics. We'll talk about American politics, and we'll talk about the age of automation and what's going to happen in 100 years' time when everything's running on machines and we no longer need humans. So we don't know. We don't know yet. Well, we went from a agricultural revolution, and we're in an industrial revolution, turning into a automated machinery. How do I call it? An automated revolution.
It's happening already, whereby people are getting integrated with computers. You'll see it with a lot of people that have disabilities, a lot of people that have prosthetics. You're starting to see these biomechanical interface interactive systems of some type, whereby through chemical or electrical signals through chemicals of human neurons, they're influencing transistors on and circuits on technology. So, for instance, the person who has a prosthetic leg, who can get the prosthetic leg over time in training to walk as if it was a real leg. I mean, I don't know if you know anything Star Trek, but that's the start of the Borg. Eventually, just I mean, you think about cell phones today and how everyone walks around with one of them glued onto them. It's not much of a jump to see someone getting an implant, choosing, say, to get an implant when they're 20, that enables them to do many of the cell phone things that we do today. And then over time, that shifts into, well, my kid needs to have this when they're born, or else they're at a major disadvantage. So it gets put neonatally, and off to the races we go. It's a matter of time.
So if you're watching this in 1,000 years' time, in the year 3020, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. Nic, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, and we'll chat again next week.
Yeah, I think it's important just to say at the end, I'm not a scientist. I just read a lot.
No, that's all good. Well, I'll get it.
Keep myself informed. You know, you don't have to be a scientist to engage on these topics. You just need to read a lot and be well informed.
When we come to an impasse where we're not sure of the answer, I'll get a scientist on, and we'll do a share screen with the scientist.
Yeah, and I'll always be honest when I'm saying this is a theory.
Sure.
I always go and I do research beforehand, and you always hear your fringe elements. There was civilization before the last ice age, and you read it, it's interesting, but you leave it at the back end. There's always the small chance that those people could be right, but it's unlikely. And you kind of form your own view of things. But the important part is that for someone listening is take some part of the conversation, whichever part you found interesting, and go and do your own research. Go and do your own building of blocks and building of connections. And both for yourself and collectively as a group of people living on the small little dot in space, it's in everyone's own interest to do.
Yeah, and I think what I took away from this episode, and I'm going to do my research on Nic as a young altar boy, just to see how he used to look when he was singing in the choir.
I'll send you some photos.
Exactly. Thank you, Nic. I really appreciate it.
No, cheers, Dan.